So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third webinar of the VALITEST webinar series on the organization of test performance studies. So VALITEST is an EU project undertaken by a consortium of 16 partners and built to improve the reliability of diagnostic tests performed in plant health laboratories across the European and Mediterranean region. So you can find more information on the VALITEST project on our website. Test performance studies are inter-laboratory comparisons that aims at evaluating the performance of diagnostic tests. And during this series, VALITEST partners are presenting the different steps of the TPS workflow through different videos, webinars, and training activities. So during today's webinar, we will present the different elements that should be considered when you select the participants of TPS. And for your information, the webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording and to the PDF presentation will be provided on the VALITEST website. And also note that videos will be launched from the platform during these webinars. And if your connection is not stable, or if you're joining using the web app, it happens that the video stops in the middle and do not restart. So if you have this problem, please try to leave the webinar and come back, or watch the video on YouTube. I will provide you a link each time a video is launched. And also, please do not hesitate to write in the chat box in case you have any problem. So today, our speaker is Anna Moisiz. So Anna is a member of the VALITEST coordination team. She joined the plant health laboratory of ANSES in France in November 2018 to manage the VALITEST project. She has a PhD in chemistry, and she worked on research projects for more than 10 years, particularly with the diagnostic company in human health, bioMérieux. And then she also developed experience in quality management, working for 7 years in pharmacy, food, and agriculture-related industries. And for the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, we will be joined by 3 TPS organizers. Natasha Mel, who works at the National Institute of Biology in Slovenia and who organized the TPS on TSWV. Tanja Dreo, who also works for NIB in Slovenia and who organized the TPS on Erwinia amylovora, and Pantoea Stewardi. And Jean-Philippe Renvoisé, who works for ANSES in France and who organized the TPS on PPV for on-site tests. So with no further ado, I will give the floor to Anna for the presentation.
Thank you, Charlotte, for the introduction. So for this webinar, selection of participants and contract, I will first make an introduction on TPS workflow, and then I will present you the common rules defined in the framework of VALITEST project. That will be illustrated by data from TPS organizers, by one example related to the TPS organized by Jean-Philippe Renvoisé on plumppox virus on-site testing, and by interviews Charlotte realized with TPS organizers. At the end, there will have a question and answer sessions, and I would like to thank Jean-Philippe Renvoisé, Tanja Dreo, and Natasha Mel to be present today to answer the practical questions that you might have at the end of this webinar. So the TPS workflow corresponds to a few steps from the selection of the test to the preparation of the TPS reports. The 2 first steps have been explained in videos already published on Twitter. The third step, selection of the test, was presented during the webinar held last Wednesday. And the 4th step, selection of participant and contract, will be the subject of this webinar. The following step will be presented during the next webinars. So the selection of competent participants is critical to obtain relevant results in TPS. Therefore, a set of common rules was prepared in the framework of VALITEST project to ensure a transparent process for the selection of the participants for the TPS. As a reminder, VALITEST project aims at producing validation data for the detection and identification of plant pests. 2 rounds of test performance studies have been organized. The first round of TPS was organized in 2019 and targeted 6 pests identified as important by the consortium before the beginning of the project. Then, for the second round of TPS organized in 2020, the pests were selected based on the needs expressed by various stakeholders in order to better align validation priorities with stakeholder needs and with the market. The common rules defined in the framework of VALITEST are the following. First, the identification of potential participants for a TPS, and then sending invitation to the potential participant. The next step corresponds to the criteria to be reached by a participant and the selection of the participants according to these criteria. And finally, the registration of a selected participant using a contract. So first, I will present you the identification of potential participants for a TPS. So the table presented on this slide corresponds to the maximum number of participants per method defined in the TPS scope for the TPS round 1 shown in green in this table and for the TPS round 2 in blue in the table. The TPS organizers define in the TPS scope a maximum number of participants per method, taking into account the availability of plant material and time and budget constraints. It has to be noted that a special care has to be taken regarding the minimum number of participants. A minimum of 10 participants per test is recommended in EPO standard PM7-122 in order to allow enough data to perform reliable statistical analysis. Indeed, resulting parameter estimates subject to an increased uncertainty as possible biases of confidence intervals if there is a smaller number of participants. So potential participants can be laboratories inside and outside VALITEST project, as for example, universities, research organizations, technical centers, or kit providers. These potential participants have been identified through different ways of identification. I will now ask you to answer the following question. What is the most efficient way of identification of potential participants? So please select maximum 2 answers between surveys, website and Twitter, professional network, previous participation in a TPS or PT, members of an existing consortium.
So we have about 80% of the people that have answered. I will wait a bit longer. Yes, so we are at about 91% and it's not changing anymore. So I will close the poll and share the results. And so 21% of the people answered surveys, 7% website or Twitter, 60% professional networked, 79% previous participation in a TPS or a PT, and 37% members of an existing consortium. So
Okay.
Anna, if you
Yes.
want.
So we can notice from your answers that professional network and previous participation in a TPS or PT are for you the most efficient ways of identifications. So I'm going to present you now the different ways of identification used for the TPS Rune 1 and 2 in the framework of VALITEST project. So at the beginning of the project, the members of the consortium have been asked on their interest in participating to the TPS. Each member of the consortium benefited from a dedicated budget for the participation to the TPS, whereas for the other participants, as the project budget does not allow any external funding, the participation to the TPS was at their own cost for consumables, chemicals, and reagents. Additionally, laboratories from the professional network of TPS organizers have been contacted, and at the beginning of the project, a survey was sent to all the laboratories registered in the EPO database on diagnostic expertise. They were asked to indicate which diagnostic test they used and which validation data already exist in the EPO region for the prioritized test. Twitter and VALITEST website were not used for TPS Rune 1 because the participants have been already asked to express their interest in participating in the TPS in the survey. So the invitation to participate to the TPS has been published on Twitter and VALITEST website only for the TPS Rune 2. Also, for the TPS Rune 2, TPS organizers from Rune 1 transmitted the list of participants of their TPS to the TPS organizers Rune 2. Other information regarding the participants to previous TPS or PT were transmitted to TPS organizers Rune 2 under request. So on this slide, we can see the repartition of the different identification sources represented as a graph. We can notice that the main parameters influencing the number of potential participants are the diversity of the sources of identification of potential participants, the community interest for the targeted test, the professional network, and the use of the social networks. So in this slide, the average percentage of sources of identifications show that the most efficient way of identification of potential participants for the TPS Rune 1 corresponds to the participants identified by the professional network. The number of potential participants identified by the survey depends on the community interest for the targeted test. For the TPS Rune 2, participants identified by previous participation in a TPS or PT corresponds to the professional network of TPS organizers Rune 1 and to the information collected by the survey, as these participants have been mainly identified by transfer of information between TPS organizers. We can notice that the average percentage of participants from VALITEST consortium is the same than for the TPS Rune 1. The average percentage of participants identified from the professional network is not much different from the TPS Rune 1, and for the way of identification by website or Twitter, we can notice that the potential participants are not yet used to these new ways of communications. To conclude, the process of identification of potential participants has enriched the TPS organizers' professional network, which could be useful for future PT or TPS. So now I'm going to present you the document that have been sent to the potential participant in order to invite them to participate to the TPS. So an invitation letter has been sent to the potential participants, and in this invitation letter, different elements were mentioned. The TPS organizer name and its organization name, the test, the methods included in the TPS and the scope, and the timeline to realize the TPS. This timeline corresponds to around 2 months and indicates the date of sending the sample, the deadline to perform the analysis, and the deadline to report on the results. With this invitation letter, potential participants have been invited to fill a TPS participant information form. In this document, potential participants had to indicate general information, the organization name, and the participant contact name and email. Moreover, they had to answer a list of questions related to the qualification criteria to be reached by the potential participants, and I will detail these criteria in the next part of the webinar. It has to be noted that if the potential participants do not return the filled TPS participant information form before the deadline, it is considered that they are not interested to take part to the TPS. So the number of participants who responded to the invitation to participate to the TPS compared to the number of invited potential participants has been represented as a graph. We can see that nearly 60% of the invited potential participants responded to the invitation for the first round and nearly 40% for the second round. The main parameters influencing the number of interested participants are the expertise on the test and methods, the availability for the defined timeline, and the interest on participating to a TPS, taking into account the budget and time constraints. So I will now detail the criteria to be reached by participants to be selected for the TPS. The objective selection of the participants was performed using criteria. These criteria are divided in 3 sections. The first one is related to general information, as for example, ability to obtain import document or letter of authorization, constraint for delivery of parcel, or participation to a previous TPS or PT. The second one is related to the expertise on the methods selected for the TPS, as for example, the number of years of expertise, validation data submitted to EPO database, or publication. The third one is related to the equipment required to perform the methods, as for example, plate reader or thermal cycler, and some additional information can be asked if necessary. For each criterion, a descriptor and a target are defined, as for example, for the criterion expertise on a method, the descriptor is the number of years and the target is superior to 1 year. Moreover, each criterion is weighted with high, medium, or low importance. So now I will ask you to answer the following question. According to you, what are the most important criteria to select the participants? So please select maximum 2 answers between technical expertise for the methods, traceability quality assurance in place, participation to a previous TPS or PT, participants' availability to perform the TPS in the time schedule, and authorization to work with a specific test.
So we have about 70% of the people that have voted. I will wait a bit longer. Okay, so we almost reached 90%. So I will close the poll and share the results. So we have 62% of the people that think that it is technical expertise for the methods that is important. 90% traceability and quality assurance in place, 21% participation to a previous TPS or PT, 38% availability to perform the TPS in the time scheduled, and 57% authorization to work with the specific best.
Okay, so that's interesting, and you are now going to see some interviews of TPS organizers in order to share with you their experience regarding the most important criteria to select the participants.
So I put the YouTube link in the chat, but I will also share the interviews directly in the app. Based on your experience, what were the most important criteria to select the participants?
I think this is probably ensuring that they had the correct authority and the facilities in place to work with the pathogen that we were including in the TPS, and also to ask and ensure that they had the necessary equipment to carry out each of the methods which they'd selected to participate in.
These were if participants have quality assurance in place, then technical expertise for the past group, which in our case was plant viruses, and expertise with the use of the methods.
Well, the selection of participants in our project was based on self-declared estimation of their experience, level of experience. And it's always that a question, how do you define that? Is it how many years somebody is performing a method, or how many samples do they analyze per year? And of course, you do expect that with novel methods, participants and the organizers will have a bit less expertise, but you need to accept this. We started with a number of different criteria, and in the end we realized that there were a few that were really critical and that would lead to an exclusion of participant if they were not met. And these were basically criteria that would prevent participants doing the work anyway. So they included whether they could not dedicate the time to meet the schedule, to perform the analysis on time. They were not allowed to work with a specific pathogen, for example, or they declared that they did not have any traceability system in place in the laboratory. However, I have to say that in our test performance studies, participants had some time to rectify this, and in many cases they were then able to correct this and finally take part in the TPS.
The most important criterion was the existence of a quality assurance or traceability system in place.
There are several. The most important for us was previous experience with the methods used in the TPS. But also important was, of course, well, essential basically is the availability of equipment that is needed to perform the tests that we were using in the TPS. And it was also preferable to have an experience with the pathogen or pathogens that are similar to Mpox virus in this case.
According to me, for a TPS, the most important criterion to select the participants is their competence, but it is not always easy to evaluate.
Being tomato brown rugose fruit virus an emergent pathogen, in our opinion, the most important criterion to select participants was the diagnostic expertise in similar pathogens. Also, the other important criteria are the knowledge of methods selected for TPS and previous participation in TPS.
Selection can be based on their technical experience, and regarding if quality assurance or at least traceability is in place in the lab.
From your answers, we can see that for you, the most important criteria were technical expertise on the methods and authorization to work with a specific pest. TPS organizer mentioned some of these criteria, but in the framework of VALITEST project, the critical criteria to be fulfilled for participation in TPS were the time schedule compatible with participants' availability to perform analysis and to report on the results, laboratory authorized by the national competent authority to work with a specific pest, and traceability quality assurance in place. It has to be noted that first, the most important criteria are considered, and if some of the participants show similar answers, then also less important criteria are considered. So the table presented on this slide corresponds to the table that has been used by TPS organizers to collect general information for the selection of the participants. We can see that for each criterion, a descriptor, a target, and a relative weight have been defined. The critical criteria are mentioned in blue in this table. The table presented here corresponds to the table that has been used by TPS organizers to collect information regarding the expertise on the methods and the required equipment. Criteria can be differently weighted to allow the selection of the participants for the defined scope. For example, if for the TPS organizer it is important that the participants have a high expertise on some test, it could be weighted high instead of medium, or the contrary. I will not detail all these criteria during this presentation, but if you want to see the complete tables, criteria for selection of participants, you can find them in the deliverable D1.1 minimum performance parameters to select tests for validation and selection of laboratories for TPS that has been published on VALITEST website. So now I'm going to present you the part corresponding to the selection of the participants according to the criteria I have presented you previously. And first, we are going to see some interviews of TPS organizers in order to share with you their experience regarding the difficulties they encountered to select the participants.
And here again, I'm putting in the chat the YouTube link in case you have problems with the video. Did you encounter any difficulty to select the participants?
I would say that it's quite challenging. And if I give example from our TPS studies, with the assessment that we did, we still got certain % of unusable results. So data sets where participants reported, let's say, wrong results for positive and negative controls that were included. So in the end, we got 80% of data sets that were okay in each of the TPS that we organized. And I would say that if we tried to put a very rigorous selection process in place, we could improve that. We could get maybe to 90–95% of usable data set. But on the other hand, I would not like to change this much, because I see TPS also as a way of learning, not only for the organizers, but also for the participants. And excluding some participants would mean also in some way artificially seemingly getting better results, but it would also mean that we are not growing as a community, and that's the only way worth growing. So.
We didn't have any problem in selecting the participants because the number of participants that then answered was relatively low. We invited 47, if I recall well, participants, and we received 15 answers. So not everybody was interested in testing for Criffonectia parasitica, either because chestnut is not a crop or it's not a plant of economic importance in their areas, or because they had already maybe a test to perform, or for other reasons. Anyway, we had only these 15 answers back, and all of them were all these laboratories were suitable. They satisfied the criteria for selection.
Yes, we did. It is not always easy to evaluate the competence of a participant. Moreover, a participant can be competent generally on a method, but can fail to perform a test in particular. So I think it's very critical and difficult to state.
Yes, we wanted to select only participants who were willing to implement all the tests selected and who had experience, but in order to have a sufficient data set, we had to make concessions and accept labs that did not want to evaluate all the tests and or only part of the samples.
No, we didn't find any difficulties there.
So after these interviews, on this slide, the number of participants who have been selected has been compared to the number of interested participants, and it has been represented as a graph. So we can see that around 90% of interested participants have been selected for the TPS. As mentioned by the TPS organizers during the interviews, the main parameters influencing the selection of the participants are the quality assurance traceability in place, the expertise on the pests and methods, the relevant equipment to perform the methods, and the respect of the timeline. So on this graph, the number of selected participants corresponds to the number of selected participants for all the methods selected for the TPS. But in some cases, not all the participants performed all the methods selected for the TPS. Therefore, it is important to have in mind during the selection process that, as mentioned earlier in this presentation, it is recommended in EPO standard PM 7122 to get a minimum of 10 participants per test in order to allow enough data to perform reliable statistical analysis. If the number of datasets used to evaluate some tests is inferior to 10, then this might have an impact on the strength of the statistical analysis and on the conclusions made. The results of the test should be then considered with great care, as the precision of the evaluation is consequently lower. For some TPS, the number of selected participants seems to be superior to the maximum number of participants defined in the TPS scope. But in fact, for the TPS organized on Fusarium circinatum, not all the selected participants performed all the selected methods for the TPS. In fact, respectively 14, 14, and 15 participants for the 3 methods selected for the TPS. So it respects the TPS scope defined by the TPS organizer. The other example is related to the TPS organized on tomato-brown rugose fruit virus. For this TPS, there was a collaboration with the Fresco project. Therefore, the Fresco consortium was included in the participants for the TPS, exceeding the maximum number of 25 participants defined in the TPS scope in the framework of VALITEST project. Therefore, we can notice that TPS organizers have taken into account the maximum number of participants they have defined in their TPS scope. So as an example, I am going to detail now the process of selection of the participants for the TPS organized plum-pox virus on-site testing. So 41 potential participants have been identified, and among them, 11 are part of the VALITEST consortium. 18 responded to the invitation letter, and finally, 15 participants have been selected for the TPS. So we can notice that the number of participants per test corresponds respectively to 15, 14, and 10 participants for the 3 tests selected for the TPS. For this TPS, the main criteria that have been taken into account for the selection of the participants are the possibility to participate according to the time schedule and the quality assurance or traceability system in place. As on-site tests can be used by users who are not experts with the test methods, the expertise on the methods was not here a selection criterion. The training of the participants being difficult to organize, it has been replaced by more precise instructions given to the participants. So I am now going to detail the process of registration of a selected participant using a participant's contract. So once the participants are selected, the TPS organizer sends the participants' contract to the participants in order to validate their registrations in the conditions of participation described in the contract. So that corresponds to the evaluation of all the tests related to the method, following the instructions and applying the detailed test protocol. It corresponds also to the respect of the regulatory requirements, so meaning that if a letter of authority is not obtained before the date set for sending the samples, then the laboratory will not be able to participate to the TPS. And it corresponds also to the availability to receive the samples in the timeline defined by the TPS organizer. So the participants has also to inform the TPS organizer on any difficulties he will encounter during the TPS. He has to provide all the results within the deadline defined by the TPS organizer. He is not allowed to share any information on samples or results to other participants or third parties, and the participant is informed that the TPS result will be analyzed anonymously. Moreover, the participants must have adopted measures to prevent the risk of unintentional release of plant pests, and it has to use the samples only in the framework of a VALITEST project, and the samples should be destroyed after the submission of the results. So the participant has to respect quite a lot of conditions of participation related to this contract. So here is a table that corresponds to the number of registered participants compared to the number of selected participants for the TPS round 1 and 2. So we can notice that all the selected participants returned the participants' contract for the TPS round 1. And for the TPS round 2, 6 participants did not return the participants' contract. And the main reasons are problems of organization due to COVID-19 outbreak, due to problems to obtain the letter of authorization, and due to the inability to realize the TPS in the conditions of participation, as for example, participants will be unable to realize the TPS in the timetable defined by the TPS organizer. So it has to be noted that participants cannot take part of a TPS if they did not fill and sign the participants' contract. So to summarize, this table presented here on this slide corresponds to the different steps regarding the selection of the participants for the TPS round 1 and 2. So first, the identification of potential participants, then the identification of interested participants by sending invitation to the potential participants. After the selection of the participants according to a list of criteria, and finally the registration of the selected participants using the participants' contract. So we can see in this presentation that in order to select the participants for the TPS, it is necessary to follow different steps, common rules for all the TPS organizers. So as an example, for Plumppox virus on-site testing, we have seen that 41 potential participants have been identified, 18 were interested to participate to the TPS, and finally 15 participants have been selected for the TPS. So therefore, the selection of TPS participants is a long process that takes around 3 months in order to get the requested number of competent participants. So now we are going to see some interviews of TPS organizers in order to share with you the improvement they will realize in the process of the selection of the participants if they had to organize another TPS in the near future.
So here again, I shared with you the YouTube link in case you have a problem. If you have to organize another TPS in the near future, what will you improve in the process of selection of participants?
So we ended up inviting just over 30 participants, and the majority of those who expressed interest we were able to include in the TPS. So I think in the future it'd be nice to be able to reach out to more laboratories that may be able to take part and increase the number of participants overall.
Regarding selection of TPS participants, I think that the rules set up in the frame of that VALITEST project are good, and I have no suggestions for improvement. And if you share these rules with potential participants in advance, most of the labs are able to make judgment by themselves if they can take part or not in particular TPS.
We were quite happy with our current setup, so I don't think we would have changed much. I think we would do it the same way, actually. Yeah.
And if I had to organize another TPS, I would enlarge the number of laboratories. I would, because I realized that yes, the laboratories have their own area of expertise, they have their own area of interest, so it's important to have the widest as possible range of options to make sure that you receive enough answers. Nevertheless, our plan was to have no more than 15 participants. So at the end, we were in our, we managed to reach our goal. But in the future, if I had to do it again, I would send more announcements, I would invite more people.
I think that we had already identified this tape as critical, and we have done our best to select the most appropriate laboratories. If we had been more demanding, we would not have been able to obtain enough participants, and this would have been a problem for the statistical analysis. So today I'm not really able to indicate what we could improve in the process of selection of participants.
We would like to have more information for participants on the real willingness and ability to participate, possibly including the technical sheet during the registration phase. This would allow the potential participants to carefully study the proposed methods and, especially in case of emerging pathogens, made some tests in advance that can help them successfully during the evaluation phase of the TPS results.
So we have seen some interviews of TPS organizers, and some difficulties have been encountered during the process of selection of the participants. So to define a maximum number of participants, taken into account the budget and time constraints, to have in mind that a minimum of 10 participants is recommended in order to get reliable statistical analysis results, to select competent participants according to the qualification criteria, and to take into account in the TPS workflow that the process of the selection of a participant is a long process that takes around 3 months. TPS organizer proposed some improvement in the process of selection of the participants to reach more potential participants and to give more detailed information to the participants, including the technical sheet in the registration process. So as a conclusion, we can notice that between 11 and 34 participants from 8 to 20 different countries were selected to participate to the TPS organized in the framework of VALITEST project. In total, laboratories from 31 countries participated to the TPS. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, so please feel free to ask them in the chat box or to raise your hand. Thank you.
So thank you, Anna. I will ask Natasha, Tanya, and Jean-Philippe to turn on the camera. And yes, so if you have any question, please ask them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and we will give you the floor to ask your question. So for now, there is no question at all. So do not hesitate to ask questions. We have TPS organizers that are there just for that, to answer your potential questions. So I will wait a bit longer. Still no question. I don't know, Jean-Philippe, Tanya, and Natasha, if you want to comment on what was said by Anna. Please feel free to take the floor.
Hi, thank you very much, Hannah, for this nice summary of our work. Yeah, maybe a comment on the letters of authorities and in general on the permits required when the material is traveling in Europe, in the EU, or beyond. This is quite an issue. We are aware of it for several countries. It takes a really long time to get such permits. So in several TPSs, particularly in round 1, we try to eliminate this step. And that means that we have deactivated our samples, for example, in the TPS we have organized. So these permits were no longer
required. However, of course, it is always good to have samples as close to the natural samples. So I guess in round 2, there were more samples that were not deactivated, but that means that the letter of authority or other permits are required. But maybe others can comment on this.
Yeah, actually, we had this material where viruses could be still alive. So in our case, letter of authority was required, and I found that this is really very difficult for many participants. I don't know, maybe this is also due to a COVID situation, but because not getting a letter of authority in time, I think the 2 labs were not able to take a part in our TPS.
So there is one very general question. Are there any collaboration with Middle East regarding TPS? So I don't know, in your case, if you had participants from the Middle East.
In our TPSs, so TPS for Erwinia Milovera and Pentoestavarti, no. But I have to also say that we are organizing proficiency tests and test performance studies outside of VALITEST, but we don't really have good contacts in that region. So I would say that as a percentage of people that actually got information, professionals from the Middle East were not represented, well, at least in our TPSs, very highly. The same goes for, the Asia and Australia, New Zealand. We also have very limited contacts. And of course, you are a bit, it's a bit more challenging because every country can have a bit different requirements. But yeah, if you are interested in collaborating, we are open to further collaboration in that respect.
So I cannot see any more questions. So yeah, to the participants, if you have any question, please do not hesitate to raise your hand or ask the question in the chat box.
Yeah, maybe I would just add one more thing. Hannah explained really well, I think, but it might be worth stressing that why do we bother so much with this, trying to assess participants in a more objective way? Because in the end, when we get the results of the TPS, we need to decide which variation in the results of a method is because of potentially lower competency of the community for that method or that test, and what is an issue with the test. And I would say that this is something that we need to address in each of the TPS, and it's always challenging. It's never really easy, because even if somebody is very competent user of one method, maybe there are some specifics of a test that are more difficult. And one of the things that we found important was to really ask participants to do the interpretation of a test. So for example, when they did real-time PCR, we asked them, of course, for the results as CQ values, but also for their opinion, is this positive or negative? Because finally that makes the difference, and that is what we are reporting.
Okay, so there are no more questions. Oh, yeah, there is one. So does VALITEST have summarized example or templates for invitation letters, contract, technical sheets, and other documents?
Yes, we are planning to prepare a book where all this will be presented, yes.
Yeah, but that was indeed a large part of our project. This was our aim, to try to do things in a more harmonized way, so that if you are participating in one TPS that the next time that you participate, things are already familiar as much as possible, so that you can find your way through all the documentation in a easier, faster way. And of course, to make the TPS results more comparable as well.
Okay, so there are no more questions. So I would like to thank Anna for the nice presentation and the TPS organizers for joining the Q&A session. And I would like to also to thank all the attendees for being here this afternoon and following the presentation. For you to know, there will be a satisfactory survey at the end of the webinar or in the follow-up email. It is really short, so do not hesitate to provide feedback to help us improve the webinar experience. And yeah, the presentation and the link to the recording will be posted on the website and also on Twitter. So the next webinar will be on the preparation and dispatch of samples. It will be on Friday, 5th of March. It will be at 11 a.m. So be careful, it's not 2 p.m., 11 a.m. Next Friday. So we hope to see you to this webinar as well. If you have not registered yet, please go and register. And I wish you a nice end of day and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.